بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وافتح لنا فتوح العارفين اللهم لك الحمد وإليك المشتكى وأنت المستعان وعليك البلاغ ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Inshallah, tonight I want to try and get as much done as possible, inshallah. So I want to try and finish this book as quick as possible. Last week we left off in the chapter that's dealing with the different categories of speech in relation to what it alludes to. So you can define or you can understand certain types or categories of speech simply by what it alludes to. And these give it different types of categories. And this is very important because this is exactly what you find in the Quran. It's also what you find in the prophetic traditions. So it's important to understand what type of category is being spoken and what does it allude to. And ultimately, what does that mean? Because it will have an impact in rulings pertaining to fiqh. The author, he says, وَالْكَلَامُ يَنْقَسِمُ إِلَىٰ أَمْرٍ وَنَهْيٍ. So he says that categories of speech or speech itself divides into amrin, that which is considered to be a commandment, وَنَهْيٍ, and that which is a prohibition. And there's a sigha, meaning there's a method or a sequence in which you'd be able to understand that. There's a particular way of saying certain things which would make that, which would give you that understanding. So the author, he says, Nahu, for example, qum, which means stand up. So if any type of speech has that level of, or that type of sequence, it's telling you to do something, qum, or i'lam, know, or salli, pray. Anything like that, then automatically you know that the original understanding of that statement is that it alludes to something or it means a commandment. وَنَهِيٍ, the author, he says, وَلَا تَقْعُدْ, do not sit down. Anything which is relative to that, also you can give many different examples. لَا تُصَلِّ, don't pray. Okay, as Allah says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُ الزِّنَا, do not approach illegal az-zina, which is fornication or adultery. These are commandments. Okay, and these are prohibitions. Sorry. The author, then he says a different type of category or different category is also khabar. Khabar is information. This is very important because khabar is what relates to a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So there are certain. So how do you derive a ruling from a khabar, from a piece of information that's related or transmitted or narrated? The author says, for example, جاء زيد, Zayd came, or so-and-so came, or this took place, or that event took place, or this transpired, or that transpired. How do the fuqaha derive a ruling from this type of speech? وَاسْتِخْبَارٍ istikhbar, the author, he says, وَاسْتِخْبَارٍ istikhbarin وَهُوَ الْإِسْتِفْهَامِ. Al-istifham is coming to try or requesting to understand something. So it's a type of speech in which you want an answer, you're trying to understand something. Okay? So the author, he says, for example, هَلْ قَامَ زَيْدٌ, did Zayd stand up or not? Meaning, did Zayd stand up? So from this, what are you trying to attain? You're trying to attain the answer to a question, and through that you can derive a ruling once you find the answer. So there's a lot of there's elements within the Sharia in which there's a lot of question and trying to understand. Istifham, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions istifham in the Quran many times, or this type, or this method, or this sequence of speech is quite prevalent in the Quran. فَيُقَال, the author, he says, so you either reply with na'am, yes, meaning the person did stand up, أو لا, or you answer with no, the person didn't stand up. And from that you'd be able to benefit from a ruling. You would have determined something. The answer has given you a level of determination in which now you are able to understand something from the piece of information that you just received. وَتَنْقَسِمُ وَيَنْقَسِمُ أيضا, there's more also categorizations. Obviously the early author or the author of the matan himself, he only mentioned a few, but there's also some that was added upon by the commentator, in which he says, for example, you can also categorize a type of speech which is tamannin, a type of speech which is wishful. So a person wishes something. And this is also something that's mentioned in the Quran. The author, he mentions, for example, لَيْتَ الشَّبَابَ يَعُودُ يَوْمًا, which means I hope, or wherein I wish for youth to come back again. I wish I was younger again. If only youthfulness could return one day. That's what it means. Is this kind of speech, would you find it in the prophetic traditions? Do you find it in the Quran? Do you find it in the sources of the Sharia? Absolutely you do. How do you then derive a ruling from that? This is going to come, inshallah. وَعَرْضٍ, the author, he says, or giving you or a proposition. A proposition, for example, the author, he says, أَلَا تَنْزِلُ عِنْدَنَا, would you not then come and stay with us? What do you understand from that? That can also give you a fa'idah or a benefit in a way in which you would derive a certain ruling. These are all different types of speech, but they're all very relevant, because all of these different modes, you find it in all of the references of the Sharia. And all of them, there's an example in all of them in which you'd be able to derive a fiqhi ruling, a ruling that's relevant to fiqh, something in fiqh, which would ultimately make something an obligation or a recommendation, or something which would be disliked, or something which would be impermissible, simply by the way in which simply by the way it manifests itself. But this is the way it does. It always turns out to be in these different categories. Sorry. Then he says, وَقَسَمٍ, and an oath. For example, وَاللَّهِ لَأَفْعَلَنَّ كَذَا, by God Almighty, I will do this and that. That's also an example. Okay? That there can also be a benefit in deriving rulings of fiqh in the way or that type of speech. Then he mentions وَمِن وَجْهٍ آخَرٍ, and also from another perspective, يَنْقَسِمُ, it divides. So this is not speaking about now what it alludes to. So this is in another way. You can also categorize speech, that which divides into that which is literal and that which is figurative. A minority of scholars opposed the idea that speech could be anything but literal, even in the Quran and the prophetic traditions. But obviously, and obviously they don't deny the reality that obviously there are certain types of language that don't actually allude to its literal meaning and its original meaning. However, they try to give it a different type of understanding, or they try to play. It was just a difference in semantics, because the actual reality did not really change in any way. There's something which is known as khilaf lafzi, which means that there's a difference only in the way things are worded or the way that things are defined, but the actual reality of things don't really change. And we gave examples of that in previous lessons. We mentioned the difference between the majority of scholars who believe that the word fard and wajib mean the same thing, and we mentioned the madhab of the Ahnaf, in which they differentiate between wajib and fard. But the reality is that if you actually look into it deeply, there's not really much difference. Because even the Ahnaf, they also mention and they also say that if a person doesn't do a wajib, if a person doesn't do a fard, the consequences are the exact same thing. The consequences are the same. The only difference would be that then the fard is considered to be more superior than the wajib. Whereas according to the jumhur or the majority, it's the same thing. So speech actually is divided, and language, obviously I don't believe from my own, I only studied this a little bit, but from what I understand, when I studied the Indo-European languages, and I looked into the major language families that people speak nowadays, which is the Indo-European languages, the Afro-Asiatic languages, there's the Turkic languages. There are languages that originate obviously in Mongolia, Mongoloid languages, and there's different types of language families. And from the little research that I did, I came to kind of realize that in almost every single language family, figurative speech is something which is very present in every single language. Okay? And it's something which is very interesting, because obviously it shows you that language develops to a point in which sometimes a meaning could be diverted away from its intended original meaning. or the way it was composed in the beginning. So as language develops, certain meanings or certain phrases will come to mean different things depending on the context. And since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran in the Arabic language, does that then not follow the same procedure? Absolutely it does. So you find also in the Quran, you find language which is figurative, not literal. And it's something which is very important, inshallah, and the author is going to come into that topic soon. So he mentioned, speech is divided into also that which is considered to be literal and that which is figurative. So there are ayat in the Quran which are absolutely literal. It means what it says it does. And then you have something which is definitely more figurative, uses metaphors and other things to show you that that's not what the context is, what determines what it means. Looking into the context, that's what will give you the answer, that will give you the definition. And this is something which existed early on from the time of the companions as well, and from the Prophet ﷺ himself. Though then he mentions and he says, فَالْحَقِيقَةُ, a type of speech which is considered to be literal, مَا بَقِيَ, he's going to give a definition, 2 definitions inshallah for each. He's going to give 2 definitions for each category. He's going to give 2 definitions for that which is literal and 2 definitions for that which is considered to be figurative. He says, فَالْحَقِيقَةُ, a literal speech is مَا بَقِيَ فِي الْإِسْتِعْمَالِ عَلَى مَوْضُوعِهِ, which means that which stays relevant in its meaning, in the way it's used, okay, in the way that it was intended to be used. Okay, that's what it means. Meaning, it should have its linguistic origin taken into consideration. If it goes away from its linguistical origin, automatically it becomes figurative. So according to this opinion, which is not the opinion that we're going to go by the way, I'm just telling you now, the next opinion that he's going to mention is what we're going to go by, inshallah, as we continue the book. But I just want you to understand what the author is saying here. He's saying to you that anything that diverts away from its original intended meaning, no matter what, or its original meaning, automatically it's considered to be figurative. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we mentioned this example quite a few times, the word as-salah, which means the prayer. So according to this opinion here, for me to say the word as-salah to mean the prayer, it would mean that that's figurative speech and that's not the literal speech, that's not the literal meaning, according to this opinion. So according to this opinion, if I were to speak to you now and I would say to you, let's all go and pray salah, that would be classified as me speaking in figurative speech and not the literal meaning of the word salah. Because the word salah has an origin that's different to the meaning that it became to be known later on. Okay, so that's what this opinion here is. So this is one of the opinion of the usuliyin, but it's not what we're going to go by, inshallah. The author then he mentions, وَإِن لَمْ يَبْقَ عَلَى مَوْضُوعِهِ, even if it doesn't stay within the boundaries of its intended meaning. For example, the author says, كَالصَّلَاةِ فِي الْهَيْئَةِ الْمَخْصُوصَةِ, like the way we understand the word salah to mean. Okay, the author says, فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يَبْقَ عَلَى مَوْضُوعِهِ اللُّغَوِي. The author says it didn't maintain itself, or it didn't stay within the realm of its linguistical meaning. وَهُوَ الدُّعَاءُ بِالْخَيْرِ, which is what? Making dua. We mentioned that that's what the original linguistical meaning of the word as-salah meant. It means to make dua, to supplicate, that's what it means. So because it didn't stay within that realm, automatically it's considered to be figurative, but it's not the opinion that we're going to go by, inshallah. I just want to mention that point. So then he says, وَالدَّابَةِ لِذَاتِ الْأَرْبَعِ, and also the word ad-dabba. In the Arabic language, the word ad-dabba is referred to what? Anything that goes on all fours. So lions, dogs, cats, hyenas, and all of that. Okay, any animal that goes on all fours is considered to be, there's a word called ad-dabba, and that's what it means. The author says, فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يَبْقَ عَلَى مَوْضُوعِهِ, because considering it, if we give it that definition, anything on all fours, that's figurative because it went away from its original linguistical, historical meaning, which was وَهُوَ كُلُّ مَا يَدُبُّ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ, which means anything that goes, okay, on the earth or traverses on the earth, any beast literally. That's the original historical meaning of the word ad-dabba was to mean what? Was to mean anything that roams the earth, whether it's four-legged or three-legged, or it crawls on its tummy, or whatever the case may be. Okay? So according to this opinion here, it would mean, or it would suggest to us then that anything which isn't, or anything which is outside of the intended original meaning is figurative. Okay? So that means if we say that a beast only, if I would say to you a beast refers to something which goes on all fours, that would be figurative and not literal, according to this opinion. But the original intended meaning, the haqiqah or the literal meaning according to this opinion would be that it has to mean what? It has to mean anything that traverses or anything that lives on the earth that's not human. Okay? Whether it's a small creature or a huge animal, whether it goes on all fours or twos, or whatever the case may be. Then he says, wal-majaz. Al-majaz. The author he says, sorry, I missed a bit here. وَقِيلَ مَسْتُعْمِلَ فِي مَصْطُلِحَ عَلَيْهِ مِنَ الْمُخَاطَبَةِ. So over there, the author he mentions, the early author Ibn al-Haramain, he says, anything that's used, the other opinion is anything that's used, okay, the literal meaning is anything that's used for an intended meaning, and that which has been customarily accepted, okay, in istilah, in definitions. That's what we're going to go by, inshallah, because that will incorporate what? It will incorporate a linguistical meaning, it will incorporate any legal meanings, and any customary meanings. It's going to include all of that, and that's what we're going to go by, inshallah. So long as you mention and so long as the meaning that you said is understood customarily to be that word, or linguistically or legally, that's what it is. Okay? We're going to go by that, inshallah. Then he gives a definition of figurative and what it means. And it's important to understand these definitions because obviously it's going to give you an understanding into the Quran and the language of the Quran. وَالْمَجَازُ Al-majaz or figurative is مَا تَجَوَّزَ بِهِ عَنْ مَوْضُوعِهِ. Anything that goes beyond the original meaning. He's going to mention both opinions in relation to what we've already said. So he says any meaning which goes beyond its intended linguistical meaning is figurative. Okay, but we're not going to go by that definition, like I said to you. The author says, أي تعدي به عن موضوعه. The author he says, هذا على معنى الأول. This is according to the first meaning or the first definition. And we're not going to go by that definition. وعلى ثاني, according to the second definition, that's what we're going to be going by. The author he says, هو ما استعمل في غير ما اصطلح عليه من المخاطبة. The author he says, anything or type of speech or wording that's used in not that which it was intended to be in the first place, whether that's linguistically or whether that's legally or whether that's customarily, if it goes beyond those meanings, if it goes beyond the parameter or the scope of its original linguistical meaning or legal meaning or customary meaning, it's considered to be figurative. And that's the opinion that we're going to go by, inshallah. Then he mentions and he says, وَالْحَقِيقَةُ, and now he's going to speak about al-haqiqa even more, which is literal, the literal meaning. He says, وَالْحَقِيقَةُ, that which is literal, إِمَّا لُغَوِيَّةً, it could be either linguistical, What does that mean? بِأَنْ وَضَعَهَا أَهْلُ اللُّغَةِ, something, okay, which was the original base intended meaning for that word, that which that word was intended to mean. Okay? For example, كالأسد, like the word lion, for example, للحيوان المفترس, for the animal which is very aggressive, or that animal which strikes, okay, or which hunts. We all know if I say to you now what is a lion, you already automatically understand exactly what I mean. But there's a level of figurative that can go into it, because a lion could also mean, if you say somebody's a lion, that guy is a lion or whatever, that could also mean that this person, you're giving this person a quality of bravery, for example, okay, or the person's very daring. So it could be also given a descriptive meaning to describe somebody with a word that's not actually the intended meaning. Okay, so the author he mentions here, the literal meaning for that in something which is linguistical would mean, for example, lion in relation to what? The animal that we're very well aware of and that we all know. The author then he says, وَإِمَّا شَرْعِيَّةً, or it could be shar'i, it could be legal. It could be literal meaning of something that's legal. It could have the literal meaning in something that's related to the sharia, for example, بِأَنْ وَضَعَهَا الشَّارِعُ, that which the sharia placed, a definition which was given by the sharia. For example, the author he says, كَالصَّلَاةِ لِلْعِبَادَةِ الْمَخْصُوصَةِ, like the prayer, okay, for the way we understand it, for that specific type of worship that we know. So the 5 daily prayers, okay, according to what we're going to be going over now, we're going to consider that to be the haqiqi meaning, the literal meaning. So if we say the word salah, the literal meaning is what the prayer that we know it to be. Okay, we're going by that opinion, not the one we mentioned before. وَإِمَّا عُرْفِيَّةً, or it could be customary. It could be a customary understanding. So all they say is بِأَنْ وَضَعَهَا أَهْلُ الْعُرْفِ. It could be something which was a definition that was influenced by the customary or the traditional or a customary understanding. Okay, depending on the customs of the people and the way they speak and the way language evolves, is something which is very well, you're all very well aware of. Certain words come to mean different things. Nowadays, they just bring new words all the time. Sometimes you won't even catch up yourself. You'll be like, what the hell does that mean? He said that word, and you realize that you're 5 years late. You don't know what's going on nowadays, and the types of words that people are using. So the author he mentions and he says, it could be customary also. كَالدَّابَّةِ, like for example, the author he says, بِأَنْ وَضَعَهَا أَهْلُ الْعُرْفِ الْعَامِ, could be something general. Like for example, كَالدَّابَّةِ لِذَاتِ الْأَرْبَعِ. For example, the word beast to mean that which goes on all fours only. كَالْحِمَارِ, like a donkey. وَهِيَ لُغَةً, but in the linguistical original meaning, it would mean, like we already mentioned, لِكُلِّ مَا يَدُبُّ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ, anything that goes and traverses, okay, or lives on the earth. It's an animal. أو الخاص, it could be particular or specific. For example, كَالْفَاعِلِ للاسم المعروف عند النحاة. For example, the word fa'il, for somebody who, or definition that was given by who? By grammarians. Okay, for that which for anybody who studied grammar, you'd know what fa'il means. So fa'il is the person who does the action. Okay, who does the fi'il. Okay, which is marfu' and everything else. Who gave that name, or who gave that definition for fa'il to mean what it means in the science of grammar? It was the grammarians who gave it that meaning. So that's customary, that's a customary understanding, because obviously if I'm not speaking about grammar, fa'il would mean something else. Isn't it? That it would mean something completely different. Fa'il is anybody who does an action or who does something. Okay? But if I'm studying grammar, then obviously if the word fa'il comes up, I know it means something else. It means something that's related to grammar. Okay, so it's like that, and that's something specific because it's something specific to a science and something educational, as opposed to what we mentioned before. Now the author he goes into aqsam al-majaz, the different types of al-majaz, the different types of figurative. Okay, so he's going to be giving some examples in Quran also, so which is quite interesting. Before we go in there, the author he says, وَهَذَا التَّقْسِيمُ مَاشٍ عَلَى التَّعْرِيفِ الثَّانِي لِلْحَقِيقَةِ دون الأول القاصر على اللغوية. The author he says, everything that we just mentioned now about the haqiqah and the majaz, the author he says about the haqiqah, he says, this is all, just like I told you, this is all relative to the second opinion, not the first opinion. Okay? We mentioned the difference between the two opinions. The first opinion is very radical. It means anything that goes away from its original linguistical meaning is figurative. That's going a bit too far. The author, from that point on, he goes on with the second opinion. That's more correct. It doesn't matter whether it has a linguistical origin or whether it has a legal origin. Okay. Or whether it has a customary, so long as it gives you the intended meaning. If it gives you that intended meaning, okay, and that's what it's used for, then that's considered to be literal. And anything beyond that is considered to be figurative. That's what he mentioned right here. Then he goes on to the differences between the different categories of al-majaz. Al-majaz obviously is figurative. The author he says, وَالْمَجَازُ, that which is figurative, إِمَّا أَن يَكُونَ بِزِيَادَةٍ أَوْ نُقْصَانٍ أَوْ نَقْلٍ أَوْ اسْتِعَارَةٍ. The author he says figurative could be in relation to the literal meaning. It could be, there could be an addition to what was mentioned, an addition. So it could either be an addition that was made, meaning you add something onto the original literal meaning, أو نقصان, or you take away, or you reduce, or you delete something from the original literal meaning. If you do that, if you add something on, it means that it could now, what once was literal, now becomes figurative. If you take something away from the word, it could, or the sentence, or the verse, or the hadith, it could mean that which was once literal becomes figurative. The author he says, أو نقل, or you transfer something from one place to another. Okay, and he will give you what that, he will tell you what that means. أو استعارة, or borrowing. أو استعارة here is referring to metaphors. Okay, you can use, say, the word borrowing or metaphors or whatever, he's going to mention it. So that's how it happens. You can either add something to it, you can take away something to it, you can transfer one word to mean one thing to another meaning, or you can use metaphors, okay, or borrow something. He's going to mention it. And he's going to give an example. So he says, فَالْمَجَازُ, that which is considered to be al-majaz, or figurative, بِالزِّيَادَةِ, by adding something onto the speech. مثل قوله تعالى, is like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. If we were to take this literally, it would mean something that it doesn't mean at all. Does anybody know what the translation of that ayah in Quran is? What does لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ mean? What's the translation? This is a famous verse of Quran. There's nothing like unto him, right? Now something was added onto this verse. For people who understand the Arabic language and the science of the Arabic language, if you were to take the literal meaning of this verse, the actual literal meaning, it means there is nothing like unto he who is like Allah. So really the verse is saying that there is somebody like Allah in the literal meaning. Because look what Allah says, Laysa ka mithlihi shay. That kaf over there means the same thing as mithl in the Arabic language. So you're saying Laysa mithlu mithlihi shay. There is nothing like unto the one who is like Allah. So that means we have to understand this ziyada, or this extra added letter here. The mufassirin have to consider that to mean a za'ida, meaning an extra added letter to emphasize a point, rather than being a definition of the same word as mithl. But it's an addition. And the word al-kaf is often referred to meaning the same thing as mithl. It means the same thing in the Arabic language. So that means, as the author he says, فَالْكَافُ زَائِدَةٌ. Al-kaf here is za'ida, meaning it's extra. It's a letter which has been added on extra. Usually if you research and you study az-zawaid in the Arabic language, anything which is extra letters, an extra a word or anything like that, usually often it means to emphasize a point. It means it's something really important. But sometimes it can actually conflict with the original meaning, like what happened over here in this ayah in Quran. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. So the author he says, وَإِلَّا, if we don't take it to mean zaid, if we don't take that kaf to mean what we say it means, فَهِيَ بِمَعْنَى مِثِل. It means the same thing as mithil, as in the verse, meaning the same thing that's like the one who is like Allah. فَيَكُونَ, then it would mean لَهُ تَعَالَى مِثْلٌ, Allah would have somebody like him. وَهُوَ مُحَالٌ, and it's something which is impossible to consider that. وَالْقَصْدُ بِهَذَا كَلَامِ نَفْيُهُ, because the intended meaning of this verse is to negate that meaning that we just mentioned. The whole point of the verse is to negate that meaning, that they are like there is something unto Allah. But if you actually study it, literally it's saying that there is somebody like Allah. That's what it says. If you take that kaf to mean mithil. That's what it means. So that means the fuqaha, the usuliyin, they say that this here is an example of majaz, be a figurative type of interpolation, or added something that was added, not interpolation, added onto the verse in order to give emphasis, rather than to give the same meaning as mithil. Very important for you to understand, and that's za'idah. Because if you take it away, if I were to say, for example, you took out the kaf completely, laysa, say for example you say laysa mithlihi shay, it means the same thing, isn't it? It means that there's nothing unto Allah. That's what it means. So that means the kaf, if you don't put the kaf there, if you take it away, it gives you the meaning. That's what it means. There's nothing like unto Allah. But laysa ka, but you added the kaf here. There's a kaf here that's added. So you say that it's an is to emphasize and not to mean the exact same thing, because the kaf actually means mithil, which would mean there is nothing like unto He who is like Allah. A very important point and interesting point. Though then he says, wal majazu bin nuqsan, and there's figurative by taking something away. So there's also a type of speech that's figurative by taking something away, okay? For example, مثل قوله تعالى, this is a famous example, many of the usuliyin, they give this example, the ayah in Surah Al-Yusuf, وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ. So the sons of Yusuf, they would say, and they wanted to give themselves some justification as to why they lost their younger brother again. So they wanted to say, ask the people of the town. But what did they say? The ayah says, وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ, which means ask the town. But what does it mean? It means ask the people of the town. You can't ask the town. What does town mean? You're going to speak to the walls? What are you going to be speaking to? Does that make sense? وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ, ask the town. If I would say to you now, go ask the town. The town knows what's going on. Obviously, you understand that automatically. You'll understand that to mean what? The people who live in that town, not the town itself, because that's something which we wouldn't really. What defines what a town actually is? You see, if we were to go by the original intended meaning of what a town is, it would be made up by the buildings, the walls. Maybe it could be given. Maybe the inhabitants of that town could be understood in a way to make up part of the town, but not the town itself. So you already understand what it means. But the fact that it's used in the Quran is very interesting. Though then he says, وَقَرَّبَ صِدْقَ تَعْرِيفِ الْمَجَازِ عَلَى مَا ذُكِرْ, which means that it's close, meaning this is something which could be considered to be figurative, because بِأَنَّهُ اسْتُعْمِلَ نَفْيُ مِثْلِ الْمِثْلِ فِي نَفْيِ الْمِثْلِ, which means because indeed the verse in the Quran, the first one that we mentioned, it used, something which would deny there being a likeness unto the one who is like Allah, to mean the actual meaning, which actually means there's nothing like unto Allah. وَسُؤَالَ الْقَرْيَةِ فِي سُؤَالِ أَهْلِهَا, and Allah used asking the town to mean asking the people of the town. So it's very important, these technicalities. وَالْمَجَازَ بِالنَّقْلِ, though he says, there could be something, a type of figurative, which changes the meaning of something. كالغائط فيما يخرج من الإنسان, like for example a person who answers the call of nature, or uses the toilet for example. Though he says نقل إليه عن حقيقته, it was transmitted or transferred from its original linguistical meaning. وهي المكان المطمئن من الأرض أو مطمئن من الأرض تقضى فيه الحاجة, a place where people would go. Usually the original meaning of the word al-gha'it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that in the Quran. Min al-gha'iti aw lamastum, Allah mentions those things that you need to do wudu if you were to experience. And Allah mentioned the word al-gha'it in the Quran. Min al-gha'iti aw lamastum an-nisa falam tajidu ma'an fatayammamu sa'idan tayyiba, the ayah of tayammum and wudu. But the actual original meaning of the word al-gha'it wasn't actually that which comes out of the human being. Rather, what actually the original meaning of the word was the place where you would go to visit in order to answer the call of nature. The author says, بحيث, at this point in time, لا يتبادر منه عرفا إلا الخارج. It only can mean one thing nowadays in the way we understand it, which is obviously that which comes out of the human body. والمجاز بالاستعارة, the author says, there's a type of figurative بالاستعارة, by borrowing. كقوله تعالى, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, جدارا يريد أن ينقض, a wall which wants to collapse. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word yurid. Yurid in the Arabic language comes from the word irada, to desire or to want something. Can a wall want to do anything? Because in order to have irada or will, you have to be a living creature, right? You have to be somebody who's a living being, not an inanimate object. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that word, which is, so it's metaphorical here. Allah uses the word irada or desire or will to something which is inanimate. That which is not an object, which cannot have irada in reality. That's borrowing, or that's considered to be a metaphor. أي يسقط, meaning it wants to fall down. The author says, فشبه ميله إلى السقوط بإرادة السقوط التي هي من صفات الحي. The author says that that's from the attributes of that which is living, a living being. دون الجماد, not that which is inanimate. والمجاز المبني على التشبيه يسمى استعارة. And the author says any type of figurative speech that likens something to something else, like a metaphor, it's called isti'aratan in the Arabic language. You borrow, you're literally borrowing, okay, something which is not from the attributes of this thing to give it a meaning, and it's from not from its attributes at all. So you understand that to be figurative speech also. So that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that a wall can have a desire to want to fall down. And that's not what it means, obviously. We know what it means. And we also know that irada or desire or will, having a will, is something which is what? From the qualities of a living being. Okay? Then the author moves on into the second chapter, al-Babu Thani, fil amr, talking about the nature of a commandment. So it's very important to understand what does al-amr mean. The author then he mentions and he says, wal-amru هو استدعاء الفعل بالقول ممن هو دونه على سبيل الوجوب. And a commandment is to request or to make a call for an action ممن هو دونه, to somebody who is of an inferior status, على سبيل الوجوب. And obviously when we mention superiority here or inferiority, we're not talking about humans in relation to other humans, talking about the examples that he's going to be giving is the relationship between the creator to the creation. So if the creator makes an amr or uses this type of wording or this type of language to the creation, okay, that's from the superior to the inferior. If the inferior makes this type of request or uses this type of language to Allah, it means from inferior to superior. And if it's from a human being to another human being, it means it's something which is what? It's something which is considered to be a request, okay? And this is usually when this is by default, okay? Very important for me to mention this point, this is by default, because there are situations in which this can also be, these roles could be defined based or depending on the circumstances of the relationship. So you might find a situation, for example, in which you might make a request from somebody who's superior to you, like the king, for example. Like a king or someone who is in authority, okay? So it would have a similar, it would have a something, it would be the similar, the ruling would be similar to that also. والأمر, the author he says, هو استدعاء الفعل بالقول ممن هو دونه على سبيل الوجوب. The author he says is to make a request or call, okay, al-fi'l, or a request to do an action. That's what this is, a commandment. بالقول, by a verbal statement. So it has to be verbal, it has to be a verbal statement, okay? ممن هو دونه, from somebody, or this request is made to somebody who's inferior, على سبيل الوجوب. على سبيل الوجوب, which would incline towards it being an obligation, which would imply obligation. فإن كان الاستدعاء, the author he mentions, the commentator, فإن كان الاستدعاء, if this request or type of request is min al-masawi, from one person who is on equal level to the other person, summiya iltimasan, it's called iltimas, which means to make a request. Because everybody here, we're on the same level. So if I ask you, if I say to you, do this for me, it's a request. It's not me ordering you. It's not a commandment or in any way. Okay? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was to use the exact same language that I used, it would mean an order, it would mean a commandment. If I were to say it to you, it would mean a request. If somebody lowered, if one of us made the same or spoke the same type of language to Allah, it would mean what? It would mean a plea, or to ask humbly. That's what it would mean. Okay? So the author says, أو من الأعلى سمي سؤالا. If the one who's being spoken to is of a superior status, it's called a plea. And this is all very important because all of this is mentioned in the Quran. The author then he says, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ عَلَى سَبِيلِ الْوُجُوبِ. And the author he mentions here, if it's not considered to be an obligation, and let's just go by this being a request by a superior to an inferior, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to us. The author says, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ. And if it's not the case, عَلَى سَبِيلِ الْوُجُوبِ, where we can say that this is by obligation, بِأَنْ جَوَّزَ التَّرْكِ, because there being the facility which allows you not to do this action, meaning it's okay if you don't do it. فَظَاهِرُهُ, that which is apparent, أَنَّهُ لَيْسَ بِأَمْرٍ, it's not considered to be a commandment. أي فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ, meaning in its reality, in the literal meaning. Okay? It could mean what? It could just mean recommendation. But the language that was used was the language that, if you understood it in the literal meaning, would have been an obligation. Allah tells you to do something, automatically, by default, if you look into the literal meaning, you'll understand it to mean this by obligation. But once you actually study the mas'ala a little bit more, you'll come to realize that it doesn't really mean by obligation. It means something else, which many scholars, they say then means that the way in which Allah spoke was figurative and not literal. And we will give examples, inshallah. And this next section here is going to teach us how it's said. Examples of how these types of statements are mentioned in the Quran. وَصِيغَتُهُ, the author says the way in which these types of word is transmitted, or the sequence in the way in which it's used, الدالة عليه, that gives us that indication, is, for example, if'al, do this, idhrab, strike, وَأَكْرِمْ, honor, meaning honor this person. Okay? Washrab, drink. That type of language is the type of language in the Quran that you find that often denotes a commandment. Okay? If we take it literally, it means by obligation. If it's figurative, then it could mean something else. It could mean either recommendation, or it could mean even it's merely permissible. It's not even a recommendation. And we will come to that, inshallah. The author is going to give a good example. The author says, وَهِيَ عِنْدَ الْإِطْلَاقِ. If it's mentioned without any restrictions, if it's universal and there's no restrictions on the word. وَالتَّجَرُّدِ عَنِ الْقَرِينَةِ. And there is no contextual way for us to understand that it could mean anything other than what it means. There's no indicator, okay, to suggest, okay, that we can understand it to mean what it isn't saying, to mean it means something different from what it's telling us. الصارفة عن طلب الفعل, the author says, تحمل عليه, we will understand it to mean what it says it means. أي على الوجوب, that it's an obligation. If it's not connected, the speech, okay, if it has nothing, there is nothing to suggest whatsoever. There is no external indicator, i.e. another evidence, for example, to suggest that it doesn't mean what it says it means. Because what it says it to us is that it's an obligation. I'll give you an example, أقيموا الصلاة. From this we understand that the prayer is an obligation. There's nothing, we don't have any other indicator from the Quran or Sunnah to suggest that it could not mean anything but what we think of it to mean, which is that it's an obligation. That's all that it could mean. There's nothing else to suggest otherwise. But say, for example, that type of language is used, but there's another indicator to suggest that that's not what it means. Okay? For example, there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ in Sahih Muslim, narrated by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, غُسْلُ الْجُمَعَةِ وَاجِبٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُحْتَلِمٍ, that the Friday bath is an obligation for every single person who's reached the age of adolescence. It's an obligation. Now, none of the fuqaha understood this mean to be an obligation, except one, the literalist school, the school of Ibn Hazm, because they were literalists. All of this figurative stuff, they don't care about all of this stuff. So obviously, we're going to put that to the side, inshallah. But the Jumhur, who accept al-majaz, they accept this concept, which is obvious, something which should be accepted. They would say to you that that's not what it means. They will say to you that actually it's only a sunnah, it's only a recommendation. Why did they say that? Because there's other indicators also. There's another hadith, which is an external indicator, a different hadith, which maintains the fact that it's not an obligation. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man tawadda'a yawm al-jum'ati fabiha wa na'imat." The person who makes wudu, only ablution, on the Friday, excellent. Prophet ﷺ said, an excellent thing that person has done. وَمَنْ اغْتَسَلَ فَالْغُسُلُ أَفْضَلُ, and the one who takes a bath, that's even better. So the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, he gave a person a choice as to which one to do, shows that other hadith needs to be contextualized. An external indicator has now indicated to us and has informed us that hadith in Sahih Muslim cannot be understood to mean what it says. So then that means there needs to be an interpretation of how we interpret that hadith, which many of the fuqaha, they say what that word wajib means is not the legal meaning of the word wajib, but it's the linguistical meaning of the word wajib, which means that which is emphasized, mu'akkad. Because if you look at the word wajib and you study its origin, what it means is something, we'll come to the questions inshallah soon. What the word wajib means in the linguistical meaning is anything which is what? Which is emphasized. So the ghusl is emphasized, we can take it, and that makes sense. So now what we did was we reconciled, and there's a whole chapter that's going to come on how do you reconcile between conflicting ahadith, because there's many ahadith which conflict. How do you reconcile? So there's a method, there's a way to do it. The author then he mentions and he says, وَنَحْوَ وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ is the example that we just spoke about now. There's no other external indicator to us that suggests to us that it could be anything other than what we know it to mean, which is that it's an obligation. And that's what it is. So then he says, إِلَّا مَا دَلَّ الدَّلِيلُ عَلَىٰ أَنَّ الْمُرَادَ مِنْهُ النَّدْبِ, except if there's another evidence to suggest that the intended meaning is a nadb. A nadb meaning here recommendation, a sunnah, that it's a sunnah. Or al-ibaha, it's something which is merely permissible. فَيُحْمَلُ عَلَيْهِ, then we understand it if that external evidence or another type of evidence exists to give us that suggestion, then we'll take that understanding. Then he says, for example, فَيُحْمَلُ عَلَيْهِ, أي for example, عَلَى النَّدْبِ أو الْإِبَاحَةِ مِثْلُ النَّدْبِ. The author is going to give us an example now. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was, because of the nature of the way in which obviously people lived in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was no concept of prison. Prison is something that didn't really exist unless you arrested somebody in their house. That was probably one of the ways in which a person would be apprehended. That would come close to what we understand to mean you arrested somebody, is that you have made this person a prisoner in their home. So you don't let them come out of the house. That was one method that existed in Arabia at that time. Another method that existed is that if there was a battle or warfare that took place, any person who was captured from the enemy side is automatically imprisoned, a type of imprisonment which was considered to be mu'abbad. And this is the definition of slavery according to that context. It was an imprisonment which was forever. Unless the person won their freedom, by paying money, or it was a kind gesture made by the person who was in control at that time to let them go for free, or the prisoner would be asked, this person who was considered to be, as the definition nowadays say, slave, a person, if they were a person who was educated, they would have to teach in order to win their freedom. So they would teach some people, they would do something, and then they will win their freedom. So the author, he mentions here, and this is very important if you read the history of this verse in Quran, because there were so many attacks against Medina, and there was many different types of warfare that was going on. The number of these types of people were increasing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made a method in which you can just make people emancipate as much as you can. فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ, there was a system in which a person could win their freedom by paying money. Work this much, inshaAllah, and give money to the person, and then you are free. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ, do kitaba, which means a system in which a person would pay a certain amount of money, that which they could afford. And also the person who had control over this person, who imprisoned this person, he or she would also have to contribute from their own pocket. So they can only bring 2/3 of the money. The other third has to be given by who? Or should be given by who? By the person themselves. This is what is known as al-kitaba. You study in the books of fiqh. So the author, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ. Allah says, but look at the language that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using. Do it. فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ. إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا. If you know that they're capable of securing themselves, do it. But obviously it's not an obligation. So automatically you understand this to mean that it's what? A sunnah. It's recommended. That's how it should be. There's another example of where it's merely permissible. The language that's used is the language of a commandment, but the meaning is something which is merely permissible. The author says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا. When you exit the state of ihram, when you're not in a state of ihram anymore, okay? Ihram is being in a state in which you are now ready to pursue your pilgrimage to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's certain things that you can do and there's certain things that you can't do. If you exit from that state, so it's a state that you're in, if you exit from that state, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it's called halal, being in a state of halal again. The reason why it's called ihram is because it's related to the word haram. Because certain things that you were allowed to do when you were not in a state of ihram, you can't do when you're in a state of ihram. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ. When you are in a state of halal again, فَاصْطَادُوا, go and hunt. Meaning for your food. Because when you're in a state of ihram, you weren't allowed to do that. You weren't allowed to hunt any game, obviously. Not maybe applicable now, but the educational point here is the one that's most important. Is hunting an obligation in the religion? No. Is it even recommended? No. It was merely permissible. But the language that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used here was what? The language which would denote a commandment. Do it. فَاصْطَادُوا وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمُ فَاصْطَادُوا. Go and do it. But it's not an obligation, nor is it a recommendation. It's just merely permissible. That's what it is. So that's an example of two things. One which is a recommendation that uses the word, that uses that which we would understand to mean an obligation, and that which was permissible, just something which is merely permissible, but uses the language of something which is an obligation. Okay? So that's that section over there. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders you to do something, does it mean that you have to keep doing it again and again? Or if you just do it one time and that's it, you are now free from any accountability. What is the nature of an action? Is it that if you were told to do it, does it mean that you have to keep on doing it? Or does it mean that you don't have to keep on doing it? So we're not talking about something like, for example, as-salah, because we know from evidence that it suggests that we need to pray 5 times a day, and that's every single day. But say, for example, something that didn't give us any indication whatsoever, all we understood from it is the base understanding that this is an obligation because there's a commandment. can we say that the nature then of any commandment is that which requires repetition? You have to keep on doing it over and over again, even though it was only mentioned once. So you never got anything else. Allah mentioned it once and never mentioned anything about it ever again, as an example. If you do it once, are you free from any accountability, or is it something that's repetitive in its nature? That's what this section here is going to be speaking about. The author says, وَلَا يَقْتَضِي التِّكْرَارَ أو التِّكْرَارَ على الصحيح. It doesn't indicate whatsoever, any action or commandment doesn't indicate that it's repetitive in nature. According to that which is the most correct understanding, as-sahih. As-sahih, whenever the word, you make sure you understand this, whenever the word as-sahih is used, it means that there's another opinion also. Sometimes the author might tell you, and sometimes he might not tell you, but there are certain terminologies for you to understand when there's a difference of opinion. For example, if the word al-asah is used, that often means that there's another opinion, and the other opinion is also strong. If the word, like the word the author used here, is the word as-sahih, if the word as-sahih is used, it means also that there's another opinion also within the issue, but the opposite opinion is weak. Okay? So these terminologies are very important. Sometimes an author might use something which is zahir. Zahir also means something very similar. It means that the other opinion is also, there's also another opinion in the mas'ala also. The author then he mentions لِأَنَّ, because, and his justification he's saying, because لِأَنَّ مَا قُصِدَ بِهِ مِن تَحْصِيلِ الْمَأْمُورِ بِهِ يَتَحَقَّقُ بِالْمَرَّةِ الْوَاحِدِ. The author he says, because the intended outcome was fulfilled. If you did it one time, the intended outcome was fulfilled. Right? So, وَالْأَصْلُ, the author he says, and the asl is وَالْأَصْلُ بَرَاءَةُ الذِّمَّةِ مِمَّا زَادَ عَلَيْهَا. The author he says, and the origin and the asl, okay, is that there is no accountability for anything extra unless there's an evidence telling you that you have to do it all the time. If there isn't any, then you did what you were told, and there is nothing to suggest that you have to keep on doing it, because unless there's no accountability for anything extra than that. إلا, the author he says, except إلا ما دل الدليل على قصد التكرار, except if there's an evidence to suggest that it's supposed to be repetitive. فيعمل به كالأمر بالصلوات الخمس, like for example the 5 daily prayers. It's something that you have to always keep on doing, because there's evidence to suggest that. There's many hadiths which says that the Prophet didn't only pray 5 times a day only on one day, but he used to pray 5 times a day every single day. So we know by just understanding those evidences, we understand what? We understand that the 5 daily prayers is supposed to be done every single day, and it's repetitive. Okay? وَالْأَمْرُ بِصَوْمِ Ramadan, and also the fasting in Ramadan. It has to be every Ramadan. We understand that because there's evidence to tell us that that's the case. Okay? But the author is saying here, if those evidences didn't exist, if they didn't exist, it would mean that we would only have to do it one time and that's it. وَمُقَابِلُ الصَّحِيحِ, and now the author is going to give the other opinion, which is a weaker opinion. وَمُقَابِلُ الصَّحِيحِ أَنَّهُ يَقْتَضِي التَّكْرَارِ, which means that the opposite opinion or the other opinion is that it is repetitive in nature. فَيَسْتَوْعِبُ الْمَأْمُورَ بِالْمَطْلُوبِ مَا يُمْكِنُهُ مِنْ زَمَانِ الْعُمْرِ, which means then the person who was given the commandment must find a way in which they can repeat as often as they're capable of doing so. So whatever your ability entails, you repeat that action all the time, as much as you can. That's what it means. حيث لا بيان لأمد المأمور به, and this is when there is no indication to tell you how much you're supposed to be doing it, or how often you should do it, or how long you should be doing it for. لانتفاء مرجح بعضه على بعض, because there's nothing to suggest that. There's no evidence to suggest that something you should be doing it every single day, or you should be doing it every single week. So you just do it as much as you can. Whatever your capability enables, you just keep on repeating it. That's the nature, that's the word. But that's not really correct, as we mentioned. Now, if you look at the madhahib, it's very interesting, and this is going to give you an example of the relationship between the madhahib and the usul. So usul al-fiqh, what's the relationship between usul al-fiqh and fiqh. How does this play a role in fiqh? So we gave an example, and this is very important because how we mentioned a point in usul now, in usul al-fiqh. These are usuli issues. How does that relate to fiqh? An example would be the ayah in Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَتَيَمَّمُوا سَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. When you're making tayammum, you make tayammum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make tayammum with the pure earth. Now the question is that something that you have to do for every single prayer? Or once, if you do it once, then you don't have to ever do it again unless you break that ablution? According to some of the fuqaha, like the Shafi'i for example, they say the nature of this verse is based on at-tikrar, which means that you have to always do it every single prayer. For every single prayer you do it. Some of the other fuqaha, they say you don't have to. This is an example of how a point in usul al-fiqh relates to a point in fiqh. Where did they get this asl from? They got it from this asl here in usul al-fiqh. So for example now, I prayed Maghrib with my tayammum. According to the Shafi'i, Isha prayer comes in, I have to do tayammum all over again. And the evidence for that is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. The ayah in the Quran says to you that when you make wudu, every time you stand up for إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, every single time you stand up for a prayer, you make wudu. Now, if you understand this ayah in the Quran, many of the mufassirin, they say to you, في صدر الإسلام, from the early days of Islam, it was an obligation for a person to make wudu for every single prayer. Whether you broke your wudu, which the concept didn't exist at that time, or you didn't, or whatever the case may be, every single prayer you make wudu. Only in the day of al-Fath, when the Prophet ﷺ took over Mecca, was it witnessed that he ﷺ prayed 5 daily prayers with one wudu. So because that happened, the fuqaha, they said, that means that it's not an obligation. But because at-tayammum was also revealed with the ayah of wudu, at that time, does the concession in wudu, because this is a concession in wudu now, does that concession also go with at-tayammum or not? According to the fuqaha of the Shafi'i, they say it's munfasil, it's separate. Meaning that the tayammum, the rulings of tayammum is in accordance to what wudu used to be earlier on. Because you had to make wudu every single prayer all the time before, at-tayammum still follows that ruling. It doesn't connect, it's munfasil, it's separate. The concession was only for wudu and not for at-tayammum. Whereas some of the other fuqaha, they say it's muttasil, meaning it's connected. So if there's a concession in wudu, that concession also needs to be also with at-tayammum. If there's a concession with ablution, there has to also be a concession with dry ablution as well. Okay, that's an example of how a point in usul al-fiqh relates to a point in fiqh. Those then he mentions and he says, okay, this is also a very important point. If you are ordered to do anything, if there's a commandment, does it entail that you have to do it straight away or not? Allah tells you to do something, whatever the commandment is, do you have to do it straight away or can you take your time? The author he mentions here and he says, وَلَا يَقْتَضِي الْفَوْرَ. The nature of a commandment does not entail al-fawr. It does not entail that you have to do it straight away. And he'll tell you why. He says, لِأَنَّ الْغَرَضَ, because the intended outcome of a commandment, مِنْهُ إِيجَادَ الْفِعْلِ, is to bring about the action. That's the intended outcome, is that you do the action. مِنْ غَيْرِ اخْتِصَاص, but there's no specificity as to which time you should do it. And there's no specificity as to why بِالزَّمَانِ الْأَوَّلِ دُونَ الزَّمَانِ الثَّانِي, that you should do it at this particular time over this particular time. Allah only told you to do this. If there's no external, if there's no indication or other evidence to say that you have to do it this many times, at this time, then you can do it whenever you have the capability. Okay? Though he says وَقِيلَ, and there's another opinion also. يَقْتَضِي الْفَوْرِ, that it does intend that it needs to be done as soon as possible. وَعَلَى ذَلِكَ قَوْلُ مَنْ قَالَ, and this is the opinion of those who said in the previous mas'ala, إِنَّهُ, or the previous case study, إِنَّهُ يَقْتَضِي التَّكْرَارِ. This is the opinion of those who say that a commandment by its nature is repetitive. They also say that it has to be what? It has to be done straight away. Now I'm going to give you an example, inshallah, of how this relates to fiqh. Should you do an action straight away? Is the nature of a commandment that you do it straight away or not? I'll tell you how it relates to fiqh, and I'll tell you how the fuqaha, they differentiated, they had a difference of opinion in this regard. I'll mention that now, inshallah. The author he mentions, or actually the author doesn't mention, but there's a point that's mentioned in some of the early scholars. They have statements regarding this. For example, the difference of opinion between Abu Hanifa and Imam al-Shafi'i, whether or not the Hajj has to be done straight away. If, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the ability to be able to do Hajj straight away, you have the money, you have the capability, you have all of the resources that's available to you, do you have to do it straight away? Or can you delay it to when you want to do it? The Shafi'iyya, they say this mas'ala, or the issue of Hajj, the nature of the commandment, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ, the nature of that verse in Quran is that it's ala tarahi, which means that it doesn't have to be done straight away. That's what he says. Whereas the Abu Hanifa says the nature of that verse in Quran suggests that it has to be done straight away. And Imam Ahmed also goes along with Imam Abu Hanifa in that case study. This is a difference of opinion as to what does the verse entail in Quran. Does it entail something that has to be done straight away, or does it entail something that just needs to be done? And it's at your own discretion as to when and what time you want to do it. And I'll give you an opinion of where Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi'i switched sides. So for example, in the masala of az-zakah, very interesting, az-zakah. Say for example, somebody had the zakah, they waited the year, the obligation was fulfilled, they had the nisab, the year came to pass, and they had the time to be able to give the zakah, but the person lost all the money. The person had ability to be able to give the zakah, all of the everything was fulfilled, and we're going to finish right now, inshallah. Everything was fulfilled. All of the requirements, all the criteria was done. But then right before they had the ability to give it, so they just waited and waited. By the time they were waiting, the money was lost. It was stolen, or the person lost it, whatever the case may be. Does that person who lost the money, who was obligated to pay zakah, do they have to owe that money back? Or is it relinquished? Or khalas, it's done. No problem. According to the Shafi'i, they say that person owes the money. It's a debt now, that this person has incurred. They incurred a debt because they had the ability to do so and they didn't do it. They didn't fulfill it when they had the ability. And where does this come from, this hukum or this ruling? It comes from the point that Imam Shafi'i says that the nature of a commandment in zakah is that it has to be done straight away. So if it has to be done straight away, if you had the ability to do so and you didn't do it, it means that it becomes a debt. Whereas Imam Abu Hanifa says that in az-zakah, so they switched sides now. So Imam Abu Hanifa says when it comes to zakah, it doesn't have to be done straight away. As soon as you can do it, you do it. Whenever you fulfilled all of the obligation, the criteria. When you want to give it, you give it. So if the same thing happens according to Imam Abu Hanifa, he says, because the nature of a commandment in zakah is ala takrar, is ala tarahi, meaning that you don't have to do it straight away. Then if a person loses their wealth, whilst even having the ability to have given it, it means that if they lost it, they don't have to give anything anymore. So for Imam Shafi'i, it's a debt that the person has to pay. Imam Hanifa says it's cancelled. That's an example of a point in usul al-fiqh that relates to a hukum or a ruling in fiqh. Okay? The author he says, and we're going to finish it here inshallah, وَالْأَمْرُ بِإِيجَادِ الْفِعْلِ أَمْرٌ بِهِ. The author he says, a commandment, okay, بِإِيجَادِ الْفِعْلِ أَمْرٌ بِهِ, a commandment to bring about an action is also an order to do that action also. وَبِمَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْفِعْلُ إِلَّا بِهِ, and also anything which would enable you to fulfill that obligation. So anything that enables you, and this is also a principle in fiqh, which is مَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْوَاجِبُ إِلَّا بِهِ فَهُوَ واجب. Anything that is required in order for you to fulfill an obligation also becomes an obligation. And this is the opinion of the Jumhur, of the Usuliyin, from the Hanaf, the Malikiyya, the Shafi'iyya, the Hanabil, all of them. The author says, كَالْأَمْرِ بِالصَّلَاةِ أَمْرٌ, like for example, an order or a commandment to pray is also a commandment to make the purification also. Because one leads to the other. If you can't pray, if the condition of the prayer is that you need purification, that means the purification is also a commandment and also an obligation. فإن الصلاة لا تصح بدون الطهارة, because a prayer isn't valid without purification. The author he says, وَإِذَا فُعِلَ بِالْبَنَاءِ لِلْمَفْعُولِ أي المأمور به. فُعِلَ, if you use the word فُعِلَ, فَعَلَ, and if you say فُعِلَ, usually that's another way of constructing the word in which you take out the fa'il. In Arabic grammar, that means that there needs to be a substitute for the fa'il. So the fa'il isn't usually mentioned. But it's very interesting over here, the author doesn't mention the na'ib or the substitute for the fa'il also. But it means وَإِذَا فُعِلَ, if the action is done, meaning that which was ordered. If it's done, يَخْرُجُ الْمَأْمُورُ عَنِ الْعُهْدَةِ, which means that the person who was ordered to do something, they are now free from any accountability. أي عهدة الأمر ويتصف الفعل بالإجزاء, and the action that they did will be considered an action well done, meaning that they've done their responsibility, they've did the action that they were told to do. That action would be given the tick, as in this person did that action. Whether it was up to a satisfactory standard or not, that's with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as for you, that's why, for example, if some people nowadays, they ask the question, I prayed salah, but I had no khushu' whatsoever. No khushu'. You were thinking about the whole prayer from beginning to end, you were thinking about money, or you're thinking about college, or you think about your essays, or you're thinking about all of the different things that you need to do. And by the time the salah finished, you woke up and you're like, whoa, what happened? In a situation like that, the prayer is valid. No, so the standard of the prayer, that's something completely different. Imam al-Ghazali, this is one of the things, this is the reason why he says fiqh is a science, and meaning usul al-fiqh also is a dunyawi science, is a science related to the world and not to the akhirah. Because he goes, this is the reality. He goes, these technicalities mean that a person could pray an entire salah with no khushu' whatsoever, and the salah would still be considered valid. So he says it's one of the sciences of the dunya. It's not a science that brings you truly close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what he says. And in reality, for a person who studies fiqh, you can actually see that. In reality, that's what it is. If a person does what they're told to do and they fulfill that action, whatever the case may be in relation to the standard of how they did it, if they fulfill all of those tick marks, if all of those ticks are done, wudu was there, I made takbiratul ihram, and I read surah al-Fatiha, I did my ruku', I did my i'tidal, I did my sujood 2 times for each rak'ah, and then I stood up for second qiyam, and I sat down for a tashahhud, and I stood up for the third, and I did the same, and I did the fourth, and I did my taslim. You give all of those ticks, khalas, you did it. You could have been playing in your mind all that time. You could have been elsewhere. You probably weren't on this planet, but still your prayer is valid. وإذا فعل بالبناء للمفعول أي المأمور به يخرج المأمور عن العهدة أي عهدة الأمر. You are now free from any accountability in that regard. ويتصف الفعل أو الفعل بالإجزاء, and the fi'l or the action that you did is considered to be done. والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.